My brother stood up at my wedding reception and announced, in front of 114 people, that the house I had just bought, the one I had spent 4 years saving for, the one with my name on every single document, belonged to our parents. He said it like it was a correction. Like I had made an error and he was doing everyone a favor by setting the record straight. And my mother, sitting at the head table in the pale blue dress I had paid for, looked down at her hands and said nothing. That was the moment I understood. Not just what they were willing to do to me, but what they had always been willing to do. My name is Fiona. I'm 32 years old. I live in Kitchener, Ontario, and I am going to tell you the most honest thing I have ever said out loud. I grew up believing that love and obligation were the same word. My parents, Kenneth and Renata, had 2 children, my older brother Liam, and me. The way our household worked was never spoken out loud, but it was perfectly clear from the time I was old enough to understand money. Liam was the one who got to be a person. I was the one who got to be useful. My father worked in commercial property management. My mother did occasional bookkeeping for a friend's landscaping company. But she stopped when I was 12 and never really went back. Money was never exactly scarce, but it was always treated like it was. And somehow, no matter what season it was, there was something Liam needed that cost more than what they had. Hockey equipment, a car repair, the deposit for an apartment he couldn't hold down for more than 4 months, a ski trip with friends because, as my mother explained it, he needed this, Fiona. You understand things. You always have. I paid for my own university. Not because we were poor, because when I was 17 and sitting at the kitchen table with a NSERC brochure and a list of scholarship applications, my father looked at me and said the money they'd set aside had gone toward Liam's 2nd year, at a school he subsequently dropped out of. He said it without apology. He said it the way you'd mention the weather. I went to the University of Waterloo on a combination of merit scholarships and part-time jobs. I worked 22 hours a week at a pharmacy counter, filled out every bursary form I could find, and graduated with a degree in accounting and a minor in finance. I had a job offer at a mid-size firm in Waterloo before convocation. Within 5 years, I had my CPA designation and had moved to a senior position at an independent advisory firm, where I handled estate and tax planning for high-net-worth clients. I was good at managing money because I had spent my entire childhood watching what happened when no one did. From the time I started working full-time, I sent my parents $800 a month. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things. My mother would call on the last Thursday of every month, not to ask how I was, but to mention that the hydro bill was higher than expected, or that the car needed something, or that Liam had a situation. I learned to transfer the money before the call ended because it was less painful than listening to the pause that followed when I hesitated. I met my husband Theo at a work conference in Toronto in the fall. He was with a financial technology firm and had come in from Vancouver to present a panel session I was attending. We talked for 4 hours in the hotel lobby after the evening reception ended. He was steady and specific, and he asked questions that showed he'd actually been listening. We did the long-distance thing for a year, then he transferred to the Toronto office and moved in with me in Kitchener. He proposed in our kitchen on a Tuesday night with no ceremony at all. It was the most right thing I had ever felt. Theo had reservations about my family from the beginning. Not dramatic ones. He never said anything cruel or issued ultimatums. He would just go quiet after the monthly calls. He would sit with me and hold my hand and say, "Fi, you're not their accountant, you're their daughter. Those are supposed to be different things." I would nod and agree and keep sending the money, because I had convinced myself that one day, after enough patience, enough support, enough time, they would finally see me as something other than a resource. We set our wedding date for a Saturday in late September. We chose a venue on the Niagara Escarpment, a restored farmhouse property with exposed timber beams, and a view of the valley that made you feel like you were standing inside a painting. We paid for almost everything ourselves. Theo's parents contributed generously toward the catering. My parents contributed $400, and a card my mother had signed in handwriting that looked like it had taken real effort to make legible. 2 months before the wedding, Liam called me. He had just ended a 5-year relationship, lost his lease, and was, his word, regrouping. He needed a short-term loan to cover first and last on a new place in Hamilton. $11,000. He promised he would pay it back before the end of the year. My mother called 20 minutes after he did and said it would mean so much to her if I could help. That family has to show up for each other, that this was what people do. I transferred the money because I didn't know how to make the asking stop. I want to be clear about where I was, financially, by this point. I had spent the previous 3 years saving for a house. I had put aside a down payment of just under $100,000. Which, for a first-time buyer in the Waterloo region, was what I needed to make the numbers work. That money had been sitting in a high-interest savings account I'd had since my late 20s, touched by no one, Not even Theo, because I had learned early that you protect what you build with your own hands. 6 weeks before the wedding, I took possession of a semi-detached home in the west end of Kitchener. 3 bedrooms. A yard. Gas fireplace in the living room. It was 108 years old and it smelled like cedar and old paint, and everything I had promised that 12-year-old girl sitting with those scholarship applications I would someday give her. I signed the documents at the notary on a Friday afternoon and sat in the empty living room afterward with Theo, and ate takeout, on the floor, and cried. For reasons I couldn't fully put into words. My parents knew I had bought the house. I'd mentioned it, carefully, because I knew there was always a cost to sharing good news with them. My mother said she hoped it wasn't too far from their place in Burlington. My father asked if I'd gotten a home inspection. Liam said nothing because Liam was apparently still regrouping. The wedding was everything we had planned. I will not give this story more than it deserves. The ceremony was outside under the October sky, and Theo cried when I walked toward him, and I have never loved anyone more for it. The dinner was long and warm and full of people who actually knew us. Theo's family danced. My colleagues made a speech that made everyone laugh. It was during the toasts. We had moved through the formal part. Best man, maid of honor, Theo's father, who said the kindest things, and things had opened up for people to say something if they wanted. These are the moments that catch you off guard. You think you're safe because the scripted part is done. Liam stood up. He had been drinking steadily since the cocktail hour. I noticed it but said nothing because it was my wedding and I was choosing to believe, one more time, that things would be fine. He tapped his glass with a butter knife. He smiled at the room, and then he said, I am telling you this word for word because it has been reconstructed for me by 4 separate people who were there and all said the same thing. He said, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge something that I don't think has been said enough. The new house, which some of you may have heard about. Our parents made that possible. Mum and Dad gave Fiona her start. They always have. That's the kind of family we are. There were a few uncomfortable claps. Someone near the back said aw. My father looked at the table with an expression I couldn't read from where I was standing. My mother smiled. She actually smiled. I felt something go very cold behind my sternum. I walked over to Liam's table. I kept my voice below the ambient noise of the room. I said, sit down now. He looked at me the way he always looked at me when I had the audacity to object to something. Like I was overreacting, like I was making a scene. Like the scene wasn't something he had just created in front of 114 people. He said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, I'm just saying what's true, they helped you. Why is that a problem? Before I could respond, my mother appeared at my elbow. She pressed her hand on my arm and said quietly, not here, please, for once, just let it go. For once, as if I was the one in the habit of causing problems. I looked at her, and for the first time in my life I did not lower my voice. I said, you told him that. You told him they helped with the house. Why? She looked away, and in that look I understood. It wasn't a miscommunication. It wasn't Liam making an innocent mistake with bad information. She had said something to him, probably many things, over many months, that had allowed him to believe their small contribution to our lives entitled them to claim credit for mine. She had built a version of events in which my achievements were extensions of their support, and she had done it carefully enough that she could stand here, in front of all these people, and look like she was trying to keep the peace. I said, we are going to talk about this. Not tonight. But we are going to talk about it. I went back to my table. Theo had seen the whole thing from 6 feet away. He didn't ask me what had happened. He just reached under the table and found my hand. What I didn't know, standing in that farmhouse in my wedding dress, was what was already in motion. 2 days before the wedding, my mother had called the bank, the branch where I'd been a client for 11 years, and inquired about my account. She didn't get any information because privacy law in this country means she couldn't. But she had tried. I found this out 6 weeks later, from a client service representative, who flagged it during a routine review call, and mentioned that someone identifying as my mother had called and been declined. What I also didn't know was that Liam had been telling people, his friends, his former girlfriend, a cousin I barely knew, that the money I had loaned him was actually their money, that our parents had given it to him, that I had just been the administrative pass-through, because the funds were technically in my account. I found this out gradually, over the following weeks, as people said things that didn't make sense, until they suddenly did. The month after the wedding, I had lunch with my cousin Petra. She and I had always been close, quietly so, and she said something that made me stop mid-sentence. She said, wait, Liam told me that loan was from your parents. He said you were just holding their savings because they didn't trust online banking. I stared at her. She said, he's been saying that to everyone. I went home and I sat at the kitchen table with Theo and I laid it all out. Every piece. The toast. The bank call. What Petra had told me, the 11,000, the monthly transfers, the years of it. All of it, end to end, like evidence, because that's what it was. Theo is in financial technology. He builds compliance systems for payment platforms. He knows how money moves and how records work and how to document a paper trail in a way that is legally coherent. He had not pushed me to do anything before this moment, but when I finished talking, he looked at me and said, very quietly, "Phi, you have receipts for all of this. You know that, right?" I had every transfer. 11 years of them. Time-stamped. Categorized. I am an accountant. I do not delete financial records. I had the e-transfers to my parents going back to my first full-time paycheck. I had the loan to Liam, documented in a message thread where he had explicitly acknowledged it was a loan and promised repayment. I had my mortgage documents, my down payment history, my FHSA statements. Every single dollar of that purchase was traceable to income I had earned and saved myself. I had the notarized ownership records with my name and Theo's name and no one else's. I also, as it turned out, had something else. My bank had flagged my mother's inquiry as an attempted third-party account access. In Canada, that flag has a formal process attached to it. I spoke with the branch manager, and then with someone from their security and fraud team. They walked me through what my options were. I made a formal complaint. That complaint created a documented record that my mother had attempted to access financial information that was not hers. I retained a family law and estates lawyer in Waterloo. I gave her everything. She read it over 2 meetings and then said, "What you're describing is a pattern of financial abuse paired with reputational manipulation. You have documentation that most people in your situation don't have. I'd like to talk about what you want to do with it." What I wanted to do was stop. Not stop fighting. Stop bleeding. Stop being the person who absorbed damage so that everyone else could be comfortable. I had been doing that since I was 12 years old, and I was tired in a way that went all the way to the floor. I started with Liam. I sent a formal demand letter through my lawyer, requesting repayment of the $11,000 loan within 30 days, with documentation of the original agreement attached. The letter also noted that any continued misrepresentation of the loan's source, including characterizing it as funds from our parents, would be treated as defamation and pursued accordingly. I did not call him first. I did not warn him. I had warned people my whole life and it had accomplished nothing. He called me 4 hours after receiving it. He was not sweet this time. He said I was being vindictive and that I was destroying the family over money, and that Mum was devastated. I said, "You have 30 days, that's what the letter says," and I hung up. I then went through every financial connection I had to my parents. The monthly transfers stopped on the 1st of the month, with no phone call and no explanation. Their phone plan. I had added them to my Rogers account 3 years earlier, because it was cheaper, and I had told myself it was practical, was removed. I contacted my financial institution and placed a formal notation on my file. I updated my emergency contacts and beneficiary designations, which I should have done years before. The credit check came back 2 weeks later. I had suspected this was possible but had not confirmed it. My mother had, at some point in the preceding years, opened a store credit card using my SIN and date of birth. The balance was small, just over $2,000, but it had been sitting there in my name, accumulating quietly. My lawyer added this to the file. We reported it to Equifax and TransUnion and filed a police report through Waterloo Regional Police Service. That report created a criminal file number. Liam did not repay the loan within 30 days. My lawyer proceeded with a civil claim in Ontario Small Claims Court. The documentation was, to use her word, comprehensive. The hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in April. I appeared by video conference from my living room, which is a thing you can do now in Ontario for small claims proceedings under a certain threshold. Our daughter had been born 6 weeks earlier. She was asleep against my chest in her carrier the entire time. Theo sat beside me at the table and held a mug of coffee he never drank. The adjudicator ruled in my favor. $11,000 plus filing costs plus interest. Liam's position, presented by himself without a lawyer because he could not afford one, was that the money had been a gift. He had no documentation. I had a message thread with his own words in it. It took the adjudicator less than 40 minutes to render a decision. My mother was at the hearing, observing. I saw her name in the participant list when I logged on. She did not speak. She was simply there, watching, the way she had always been there. Present enough to observe, absent enough to deny involvement. The credit card fraud matter resulted, 8 months after the initial report, in a formal charge against my mother under the Criminal Code of Canada, specifically fraud under $5,000. Her lawyer reached out to mine about a possible resolution. The resolution they proposed involved my cooperation being withdrawn. My lawyer communicated that this was not something I was prepared to offer. My mother entered a guilty plea in provincial court in Hamilton. She received a conditional sentence, 12 months to be served in the community, with conditions including restitution of the full balance and a prohibition on accessing any financial accounts or information belonging to me. She has a criminal record now. That follows a person. In Canada, a conviction like this appears on background checks and can affect things like employment, volunteering, certain kinds of travel. She is 61 years old and she has a criminal record because she used her daughter's identity to open a credit card. My father called me once during all of this, just once. He said he thought I was being extreme. He said I had always been too sensitive about money, ever since I was a kid. He said Liam was struggling. He said my mother hadn't meant any harm. I listened to all of it and then I said, I know you believe that. I don't think it's true, but I know you believe it. And I told him I had to go. I have not spoken to any of them since. I want to say something about what that silence feels like, because people always assume it must be the hardest part. It isn't. The hardest part was every year I spent managing their comfort at the expense of my own. The silence is the easiest thing I have ever done. Theo and I painted the third bedroom last spring. Yellow, the color of our daughter's name, Willa, which I know is also a color that needs more than one coat to look right. And we put on two. She sleeps in there surrounded by exactly the life we built for her, which is ours, which is documented and paid for, and no one else's. Some nights, I walk through the house after she's asleep, and I run my hand along the doorframe of the living room, and I think about that 12-year-old girl and the scholarship forms and the pharmacy counter and all the work she did quietly, so no one would see how much she needed it to matter. It mattered. It was always hers. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I mean this sincerely. Do you think I went too far? A lot of people, when they hear this, get quiet when they get to my mother. She didn't forge the loan. She didn't take the microphone at my wedding. That was Liam. But she made the call to the bank. She built the story. She stood there and smiled when my brother said what he said in front of everyone I love. What would you have done? Drop it in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. What city, what time. I read them all. If this meant something to you, if you have ever been the one who shows up and gives and manages and covers and no one ever once thought to ask how you were doing, please subscribe. There are new stories here every week. You are not carrying this alone.